Okay, here is the second part. Riverside and Herbert Hoover High School students of mine. We're going to now talk about education in cities. Education is something that I'm very passionate about. I pour my heart and soul into trying to be the best teacher I can be. Some days are good, some days are bad. I'm sure you guys would agree with me. But we're really pretty lucky where we're at in terms of our school system. There are always problems. We could lodge complaints, and some of your complaints are certainly legitimate. But when you compare some of the better public schools with some of the worst public schools in this country, it's pretty amazing, the disparities. Schools in urban settings face all kinds of challenges that are way more daunting than schools outside of urban settings, especially when you get into inner cities. Some of those schools are really not good places to be. So some images of inner city schools, that's kind of a spoof. You kind of get the idea there, but this is some of the stuff that you see in inner city schools. This is an image of a real public school. I believe, I don't want to be wrong here, but I believe this is in New York City, an image of one of these inner city public schools, high schools. Kids were having class in this room. They would literally move their desks to where the ceiling wasn't falling down on them so they could try to have class. Now, can you imagine trying to sit in a classroom like this, trying to learn something? It would be very difficult to do. Overcrowding is a really big problem in public schools, especially in decaying inner cities. Teacher-to-student ratios here in West Virginia in high schools are really pretty good. You might have like 25 students per teacher, which you might think that's a lot of students. But when you get into some of these public schools in inner cities, it might be closer to 50 or 60 or 75 kids per teacher. So that's not good at all for anybody. Immigrants. With immigration largely being an urban phenomenon, pose specific problems for public education. What you have to realize is that legal, not illegal, but we're talking about legal, legitimate immigrants who migrate to this country generally land in urban areas or in cities. Well, they're bringing with them big families a lot of times because they're younger, and younger people tend to have bigger families with children in the school system. They're poor. They're not stable. A lot of times they have health concerns. There are language and cultural issues that tax these school systems that these kids are now in. There's a lot of problems, especially in schools that are close to the border, for example, where you have a lot of Spanish speaking, for example, not to pick on Mexico, but where you may have a lot of Spanish speaking children who are now in the school system. It creates problems for the kids who are there who already speak English, because the teachers have to devote time to Spanish-speaking kids, and it becomes a cultural nightmare in some places. So immigration can create some problems. Not that immigration is a bad thing inherently, it certainly is not. Social promotion is the next thing that I wanted to talk about. This is the passing of children and adolescents through the school system, even though they have not earned adequate grades. And I can tell stories for hours about kids I went to school with. There's one story that I always tell. Teachers, and I indict my own when I talk about this, teachers are notoriously bad for this. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people just recently, this year, last year, the year before that, I've seen students get passed through with good grades when they really didn't earn those grades, maybe because they were popular kids, maybe because they were disruptive and the teacher just wanted to get rid of them, get them through so they don't have to deal with them anymore. You will not find a bigger supporter of student athletes than myself, for sure. I've coached. I'm passionate about sports. But I've seen really good athletes who are very good students get passed through, awarded grades so they can maintain eligibility to play for years. And then when they get into college, they can't make it because they've just been passed through, which is a horrible indictment, not against those students, but against the teachers for allowing that to happen. So social promotion happens. You guys, I'm sure, have seen it where you've had students you knew didn't make the grade, but they have been kind of passed through anyway. The one story that I'll tell, and I'll shut up and I'll move on, I was a high school senior, and I was in a pre-calculus class, and I happened to be in there with our big track star, and she was very good. And my math teacher was also our track coach. And I never will forget helping her with homework, or trying to, And I knew the grades that she was making. She was making D's and F's. She was trying, but she just wasn't quite getting it. And I was struggling too. I had a C, and I was happy to have it. And I remember when she got her report card, I just kind of asked her, I'm like, hey, what'd you get? How'd you do in pre-calculus? And she just kind of smiled and giggled, said, oh, I got an A. I'm like, an A is in apple? Really? So, and I knew what was going on there. I mean, I put the pieces together pretty quickly. So that's unfortunate, and that's something that can be a problem. Now, public school choice. This is something that has been in the news over the last 10, 15 years. George W. Bush introduced the idea of school vouchers. The idea that if a school has been identified as a school of improvement, in other words, since you guys are taking standardized testing right now, a lot of you, if those standardized testing scores reveal that your school is not performing at a sufficient level, then parents can choose at taxpayer expense to send those kids to a different school where the test scores aren't so bad. And this has ramifications for teachers. Principals lose their jobs all the time because of low test scores. And it's really, there's a lot of unfairness and unfortunate things that get tied into that as well. At the same time, though, if you're a parent like me who's passionate about your child's education, like I am, do I want the option to send my child to a different school if the school she is at is failing miserably? Yeah, I would take advantage of that. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But that's the whole idea of public school choice. And you see this more in urban areas than you do in places like West Virginia. It's not that big of a deal. You don't see parents trying to get their kids out of school systems due to failing grades as much as you do maybe sports. Kids want to go play sports at other schools. That's not really what we're talking about here. Two school systems. I want to try to get this in before I end this part of the video. I talked early on in this lecture series about the disparities in public schools. Some of the worst public schools you couldn't believe or imagine how awful they are. And some of the best public schools you would be surprised as well at how wonderful those schools are. There's a high school in East St. Louis, Illinois that I've mentioned in class before. It's called Martin Luther King Jr. High School. It's in one of the most dangerous cities in the country where you have incredibly high crime rates. I'll give you some images of East St. Louis, Illinois. It's right on the other side of the river of St. Louis. You can see the arch right there. Highest crime rates of anywhere in the country, just about. You have a 99% African American population. You have basically, there's like 2 or 3 out of every 10 buildings are open for business. Most of the buildings here are boarded up. The most thriving business in this area is a whorehouse, which takes place in a building that used to be a church, which is terribly sad. I've actually been to East St. Louis, Illinois by accident. I was trying to get over here to the arch, and I got lost here on this side of the river, and about lost my life doing it. I'm not lying about that. It was pretty scary. I've told that story to some of you in class. But in the high school, the kids would literally, there's some more images of East St. Louis, Illinois. In Martin Luther King High School, this high school right here, kids would literally have to traipse through sewage that would seep up through the tiles of the floor. The buildings, you could see the windows were kind of busted out. Teachers wouldn't want to teach there because it was dangerous. They couldn't attract good quality teachers. No computers, no books. Just a terrible place to go to school. And these kids, again, largely African American populations, because poverty and crime and minorities they kind of go all together. And in these densely populated inner cities, you have these black kids who are producing low test scores. Well, can you imagine if you had to go to a school like that? Probably wouldn't be a good situation for you. Some of the lowest test scores in the country. So people look at these kids and think and say, well, what's wrong? You lazy kids, it's because they're black, they're thugs, they just don't try, they don't care. Well, if you had to grow up in a situation, in an environment like this, you probably wouldn't do very well either. So a lot of it has to do with the social environment of the situation. Okay. Now, versus a public school in Rye, New York. This is also a public school. It was in a very well-to-do suburb with wealthy parents contributing lots of money with a largely white population. The school, I'm going to skip to that. The school in Rye, New York that I'm going to talk about, this is Rye High School. You have parents making millions of dollars in donations to this school. Some of the buildings, some of the classrooms have like wood paneling, carpet, state-of-the-art equipment all the way through. So you can imagine the opportunities for these children here would be fantastic. And their test scores are a lot higher. Is it because they're white? Well, no. It's because they have advantages, many advantages that kids in East St. Louis do not have. So some images of kids in Rye, New York. There's nothing wrong with being white. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy. We're not doing that. We're not saying that. But, the results are clear. The advantages of this school over the previous are just tremendous. And it stands to reason these kids are going to perform better in school. They're going to end up having more success in life. Not because they're inherently better people, but because they have better opportunities. Here's an image of Rye High School. It looks like a private college. An image of a home in Rye, New York. So, pretty good place to be. And we'll call that the end of this part. Thanks.